Good evening, all of you, and welcome back to today's lecture where our resource person will be delving on modern age, as you can see, modern age part 2, where we will be talking, where our resource person will be talking about the Georgians, about the lost generation, Harlem Renaissance, war poets, statism, muckrakers. So some important topics, and I'm sure our resource person today, as you can see on the screen, is Dr. Prithivika Sridhar, who most of you all are aware of. And I also hope that you all will enjoy today's lecture. On behalf of Team DAATH VOYAGE, I welcome Dr. Prithivika, and I also will like to take the opportunity to introduce Dr. Prithivika to all of you. Dr. Prithivika presently is working in Loyola College and completed her PhD from Central University of Rajasthan in 2017 and was awarded a degree in 2019. Her area of work is on, her PhD focused on looking at women writings from the lens of Camus' existentialism, the writer being Shashi Deshpande. And during the course of her research, she had the opportunity to interview the writer in person, and excerpts of the same were included in the thesis. Her area of specialization is women writing, Indian women writing, Western critical tradition, queer literature and theories. And with a teaching experience of 4 years, as I informed you, she is presently at Loyola Academy, Hyderabad. During the course of her PhD and later on, she has presented papers at various national and international conferences and published her research papers in Scopus Index Journals. On behalf of Team DAATH VOYAGE, I would like to thank you and would like to welcome you once again on this platform, and thank you for sparing time. You are too busy nowadays, I know, and I might be one of the reasons. So thank you for bearing with us, and thank you for spending so much of time on your research for these lectures. Without wasting much time, the platform is all yours, Dr. Prithivika. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir, for the introduction. Am I audible clearly,
yes,
sir?
Yes.
Right, fine. Without unto further delay, I would begin because we are beginning a little late, and let me just try to wind up in time. So that's the thing. All right, people. We today will be delving into a topic by name Modern Age 2. All right, we have a list of movements which define the age, as you're able to see this. But as usual, I would try to take a little bit of a backdrop in order to understand the context of the coming of this particular age. England, not exactly at a mode of transition. We look at England already into transition. Okay, a transitioned England rather. Like when we look at, we go back and trace the ideal England, what we find in the Victorian period. And then we come to modern age. You might have already understood that towards the, rather I would say towards 1850 or 1800s, when it was a coming of industrial revolution, the dilemma between science and religion. But then many people look at modern age as a very negative age because it was primarily governed by war. Our lecture here is determined by how war affected literature. All right. So now I would leave it to your judgment and your criticism whether we have to look at the literature negatively, but primarily most of the critics have judged the writings and the scenario in a negative way. It is also important to understand like what was the context against which we look at these writings. One being the World War I. The second one was industrialization. Many of the writers look at as to how the invention of the atomic bombs and the invention of warfare were all a consequence of our industrial revolution, or let's say development in science and materialism. That is the coming of modern age, as much as the word denotes, whatever it denotes, modern age, facilitating your survival in a modern age. Like today, with the help of technology, we are definitely, somehow we are facilitated into a more easier life. So that was the promise with which modern age began. But then, somehow there were negative effects of the modern age. All right. So I do not want you to judge, or maybe it's not right on our part also to just look at the age negatively. Most of the critics tend to have a very negative outlook towards the age. But then let me just warn you on it. Literature is never about right and wrong. It's not about white and black. It's about looking as to what might have brought in this perspective. All right. Because most of the times the way I will be looking, or maybe sometimes quite unconsciously, because, considering that most of you are, students who are focused on preparing for NET or, MA. So most of the primary understanding of all these movements look at the age in a very negative way. All right. So that was the kind of a disclaimer before we venture ahead into the modern age. So, right, we are looking at the development of these writings, development of literature against the backdrop of World War I. How World War I affected the society, and how did that society influence the writings? All right, for a very long time, you might have even observed, for a very large period of time, till at least, like, let's say, till Victorian age, you might have also observed, maybe slightly to a larger extent, the writings might have imitated art for art's sake, right? The kind of writings which came about portrayed a very grand picture. Like the writings are always to inspire you, not to demotivate you, or not to, give you a very negative picture. True, in Victorian England, it so happened that, the kind of picture what we got of the age was quite, what do you say? I'll not say negative. Maybe, we saw the harsh realities, like realism governed the age. That was the point. But then when we come about to, this particular age, we are not only looking at from a realistic edge, but we are looking at more of a consequential literature. All right. So that's what I would, that's a disclaimer before rather we, venture into these, writings. All right. And right. I just digressed at one particular point. Yes. The kind of literature which we might have observed before the coming of this age might have been the literature like art for art's sake. That's something which is inspirational. Like if you might have observed Spencer's and his Fairy Queen, one example of it. Okay. So what does it do? It gives us a very grand picture of England, portrays about chivalry, portrays about heroism, patriotism, right? We look at the same feelings of patriotism, heroism, but maybe in a very anti manner. All right. So we're not going to judge it as positive and negative. We're going to say it in an anti manner. See, generally, when we look at war, we always look at war in a very heroic, patriotic manner that, gives you a sense of purpose, gives you a sense of fulfillment, that you're standing up for your nation when the nation is in need, a symbol of nationalism and patriotism. But what are the other effects of war? How war affected the society and in turn literature? So that is what we are placing these movements under the backdrop of World War I. All right. So all right, so that is where we begin from. Just one more point to look at here would be, like I said, we're not looking at literature from an art for art's sake category. We always looked at literature to be inspirational, but here we look at a realistic portrayal of the society. So the society, so that no longer the people, look at the age as something which is beyond what it is. All right, like for example, if we look at like I said about, Fairy Queen. Fairy Queen is something which is beyond, what you can perhaps envision today. I cannot see a Fairy Queen happening in, let's say, England anymore. Exactly like that. Okay, maybe like we use the word far-fetched from reality. Those were the kind of writings, which came up earlier. But here we are portraying into a really hardcore, realistic writing. That is what we, see across. So, you might, conveniently by the end of the lecture, you might judge, oh my God, this is so harsh, this is so limiting, this is so demotivating and so negative portrayal of, England. But yeah, maybe, the World War I and World War II did cast a negative impact. Society changed and situation changed, over time. And then, we transgressed. But at that particular point, we are looking as to how people envisioned wars, envisioned England, per se. So that is the context against which we commence. All right, we are looking at Georgian poetry. All right, so when we look at Georgian poetry, let me just pick. I had scribbled many things for my talk because I tend to forget on many things as we commence. So just give me a moment to pick up. All right. So we look at, this is a little bit, right. We are looking at a definite reaction from the decadent poetry of the 90s had begun. All right. So I would want you to understand at this particular point, the kind of writing which came about in the Victorian age. Okay. So that was a kind of writing which was of the category of art for art's sake. All right. This is what I was discussing it for you. And, suddenly we look at the kind of writings which emerged in the modern age, which could be understood as the writing which is a decadent writing. All right. So the writing which did not keep up to the grandeur, exactly like what I spoke to you about Fairy Queen, right? So the grandeur, what we saw in those poetry, like we always look at art to be inspirational, life takes some inspiration, needs to take some inspiration from art for it to function. That kind of a thought procedure was waning. All right. Now, again, like I said, as literature, people into literature, it's not right on our part to look at the positive and negative part of it. We might have our own, personal fallacies attached to it. But then I would want to distance myself and look at how Georgian poetry, like I used the word, is coming into the category of consequential literature. All right. So you can see here how the category of art for art's sake was, modified by, how life art imitates life. All right. So this decadent word is what we use when we talk about the category of cultural, degeneration and, cultural moral degeneration. More than not only cultural, moral degeneration is also a category that we look at, under this particular categories. So, you might have observed, when you look at especially the previous age, we will have to look at this coming of Georgian poetry in consequence to, let's say, Victorian poetry, because what was the age before modern age? That was Victorian age. Victorian age was a grand age, all right? So suddenly, that age had shut its eyes to the grim realities of life. Like, for example, one being the class system, all right? So the social realities of the age were just starting to emerge in Victorian literature, but it so happened that, majoritarian literature of that particular age had their eyes shut to the realities of life. All right. So it so happened that, ornamental literature came about in a very highly musical verse. All right. So, for example, maybe it is also in comparison to the kind of literature which came about earlier. You might have observed the literature of, let's say, Dryden, and let's say the literature of Pope, highly ornamental, highly majestic, and let's say, lofty verses. But then what is the subject that we are dealing with? We are dealing with a very trivial subject. All right. So this kind of an outlook. And then you might have even observed that when we talk about the coming of modern age, we suddenly see that, topics are becoming loosened. All right. We no longer follow the style of iambic pentameter. We entered into a blank verse kind of a writing. So many of the poetry, like, for example, how there is always a constant debate between older poetry and newer poetry, older poets and newer poets. Okay. Similarly, people might have felt that there is no loftiness, there is no authenticity, or let's say there is no grandeur in the kind of poetry that is coming about in the modern age. It's exactly like this. Like today, if you look at young researchers and old researchers, sometimes the kind of we never thought people would be researching on, let's say, Vampire Diaries. People would be researching on Harry Potter. People would be researching on graphic novels. People today are researching on, let's say, the Archie series. We might have thought about it as trivial a while ago. Today, comic literature is one kind of a literature. We are studying graphic novels. We are studying how these graphic novels are, perhaps making us understand the concept better. But so now our outlook has changed over time. Exactly like the kind of, debate one might enter into when we're talking about old music and new music. Some people might not like the kind of, for example, rap. Okay, rap music. Many people might think that, what is rap music? Like, what are we talking about? The words are so straightforward, they're not decorated. But look at the kind of, lyrics which you might have observed in, let's say, the older kind of music, which you might have heard, maybe in the late 90s kind of music. You had everything concealed. You had love concealed. Everything was concealed. Even sexualities were concealed. But today, in the kind of music that we see today, everything is more open, more frank, and more dealt in a more straightforward manner. Exactly like that. If you have to understand Georgian poetry, this kind of an example would make you understand in a more neat format. All right, so this is just the coming of taking us back to a grander poetry, because, people might have felt that, maybe modern age is, is entering into moral degeneration. It's entering into cultural degeneration. So we need to preserve the aesthetics of art alive. And that's why we go back to a more promising kind of a poetry. And that is your Georgian poetry. So if you are going to say that, so is Georgian poetry taking inspiration from Victorian poetry? Yes, I would agree to that. Absolutely. Okay, so the idea is to treat natural things as natural, beautiful. That is, it is neither it is, too modern, or, neither it is, an imitation of the lofty strains of the Victorian poets. So here we understand at this particular point that, the kind of poetry that we see here is neither too modern or exactly like the kind of modern poetry which is coming about to be, nor is it too lofty. Exactly. Like, for example, if you might have observed the poetry of Tennyson, it just forgets the flaws of England when he writes Ulysses. He writes about a promising England, forgetting about the fact about how greedy Ulysses might have been. So we are trying to bridge, perhaps, the kind of, laxity which is coming about in literature with modern age writings, and the kind of false promises and, an elevated platform for, petty topics, or let's say an elevated platform for trivial thoughts. So that, bridge is being balanced by the coming up of Georgian poetry. Now, it so happened when we talk about Georgian poetry specifically, came about in the period of 1911 and 1922. Clearly, you understand that that is a period of, period of modern literature per se. And then we are looking at, it was a coming of George V. And, it was a promise of a new poetic age. Maybe you can say, I would not say a poetic age, I would say restoration of the kind of aesthetics which was associated with poetry that is being restored in this particular age. Okay, so we are looking at, the poetry of poets include Walter de la Mare and Siegfried Sassen. Siegfried Sassen is one of the most fundamental Georgian poets that we're going to observe here. And then, the idea was to make poetry more accessible to the wider public. And when I use the word poetry in the form as to how literature considered was right. All right, they consider that, you are dismantling poetry, you are somehow, degenerating poetry. So they consider themselves as beholders of poetry in order to set poetry right. So that was the purpose which they came about with it. So when you look at this juncture, okay, what do you do? Very consequential. Okay, you look at the fact that you go for countryside for inspiration. Very true. Like, today sometimes when we are so caught up in the humdrum of our lives, in the everyday mechanized routine, we want to go to a very quieter place. Today, you might have seen in most of your Insta videos also, many people have begun work from mountains. You see a lot of, promotion being received for, places like, let's say, Himachal Pradesh, or let's say the Spiti Valley. All these, areas are getting a lot of, promotion for that matter. Why? Because we feel that, the humdrum of life is somehow killing the aesthetics of literature. So if you have to really identify and enjoy and get inspired by aesthetics of literature, we require a transition. And for that, we need to make a move to the countryside of England. All right. So that was the outlook with which they began. You can understand it as clearly, clearly in that way it is consequential. And this other moment that I want you to understand is exactly because we are trying to restore a kind of a Victorian outlook. All right. So that in that way, you might have even observed Matthew Arnold wrote a poem by name Scholar Gypsy. All right. Scholar Gypsy is also set under a pastoral backdrop. Always the countryside of England is somehow the way one can regenerate England to its promising ideology, or its promising stature, what it was years ago. All right. Yeah, you have a series of writers that you see. It's very, some of these writers, especially D.H. Lawrence, have been carried from the Victorian period. You can understand D.H. Lawrence has been, it's very, very shocking also for us to understand that how these writers, on one hand, are Georgian poets. For example, when you see D.H. Lawrence is somebody who has come about into Georgian poets, somebody who is going to keep balance for us between the modern writings and the lofty writings of the Victorian period. At the same time, D.H. Lawrence was the one who came into, a skate, all because of the fact, because he wrote Sons and Lovers, something which was talked about explicit sexuality. So, one might say, if you're going to ask me in which category I'm going to put him to, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to only look at the literature. I'm not going to look at the writer. All right. So literature transitions, writer transitions. So, maybe D.H. Lawrence felt at one particular point that, I need to preserve the aesthetics of literature and might have taken to Georgian poetry writing. All right. You understand that this did not have any school of poetry per se, because, you might read a lot of schools at this particular, for example, when you, especially in the 20th century literature, you read about Frankfurt School of Writing, you talk about Roman Jacobson School of Writing, but then here we do not have, any school of poetry per se, but then, there are certain formal qualities of poetry, right? I've told you, like, when we look at the modern age period, we generally don't appreciate, rather the critics generally do not appreciate the blank verse style of writing. So we wanted to retain the metrical form of writing. Maybe you could say iambic pentameter, or maybe, hexameter, or maybe heroic couplets. All these rhyme schemes, all these were kept intact. Romantic subject matter saw nature in a gentler and a more benign aspect, right? So, it's not that if you're going to ask me immediately that, so what did it have influence of romanticism? I cannot say everything in that way, because, we always find it like I said about countryside is considered to be the regenerator, exactly. So the first place that you would go to if you are a regenerator is nature. So nature became the, the regenerator. So only in nature, maybe you might be able to identify the true aspects of literature or true aspects of the subject that you're dealing with. So nature is a teacher. So we're looking at nature in a more gentler and in a more benign aspect. There's one more thing that I want you to understand while we are looking at this. Sometimes in many of the writings, we look at nature as something which has been destructive as well. So many people, if you observe, especially when you see modern age was a time when England was into its, was into its colonizing. Okay, it was a colonizer at that particular point. So we looked at the very fact that they went into expeditions. We looked at nature as a storm, okay, as a powerful storm, as a negative force. All right, but here we look at nature as a more gentler, gentler force governing our writings and a more benign aspect. All right, so. Themes of nature and rural life, I've already spoken about it. Quest for simplicity, exactly like how the contemporary thought what exists, that you want a more simpler life without complexities, and that's why you make a move at times to mountains so that you can just replenish yourself and get back to the humdrum of a city life. That is exactly what is happening here in Georgian poetry. All right, so the love for natural beauty. All right, natural beauty, some people might say artificial beauty is, took a lot of shape in the modern age. You already know that because of the coming of science and technology, anything natural can be replenished with the artificial. Like, for example, today we have artificial plants for that matter. Okay, so like I might, set up a place which is, filled with all artificial plants. But then, exactly that is what science and technology has done. It has given us the natural in its artificial form. Exactly like that. But then, we are going for a more natural. We're talking about how perhaps the coming of science and technology has made us furthered from the, the natural beauty which exists with respect to nature. All right, exactly what we are trying to tell through this Georgian poetry is also one more thing, that nature is superior. How much soever development might come in, science and technology might come in, nature is superior to all these, percepts. Simple rhyme schemes and metric. We needed metrical patterns and rhyme schemes, not as metrical as to how it was in the Restoration period. Things definitely fused down in the Victorian period. We're keeping that aspect alive when we're talking about it in Georgian poetry as well. All right, so I have picked up one, line here for reference. Okay, so here it is. So you're able to see that this is a line, a hummingbird by D.H. Lawrence. So it is about looking at a hummingbird, because nowadays you can read the lines. I guess that will explain things better. I can imagine in some other world, okay, some other world, because hummingbirds are not found in this technologically gripped world. Primeval, way back, dumb, far back ago, in that most awful stillness that grasped and hummed, hummingbirds raced down the avenue. So exactly like today, we talk about the fact that we no longer see sparrows. Exactly like that, you see at this point that, maybe at that point, hummingbird could be heard and hummingbird could be seen racing down these avenues. But then, we just, looking at a lost world, and then, perhaps reminiscing our, aesthetics and writing and literature with respect to that. All right, so you can see here hummingbird's fantastical past. Okay, so he's only able to imagine. I can only imagine, because this kind of a world when hummingbirds race down the avenues, all right, hummingbirds could be found on the streets, American language avenues, right? Or you talk about the fact that it existed way ago. Today we don't see hummingbirds racing down the streets. So this is only a world which I can only imagine today, because this has been a consequence of destruction brought about with the coming of science and technology. All right, so this is how he understands England, a newer England, with a pang to pangs of separation from the kind of more naturalistic world which existed before this artificial world has been brought in because of the coming of science and technology. Also, there is one more point, if somebody would ask here, that don't you think that Georgian poetry in some way is trying to bring back to us the presence of nature, and rather the presence of God, the creator, right? Maybe that's what we're trying to do, because with the coming of science and technology, the outlook what exists as man is superior. But maybe Georgian poetry also tried to keep the fact that there's something more prior to you, more superior to you, and what exists is nature, and nature in turn translates to the creator, and then that is to the Lord. All right, so we're just trying to bring back religion, which is already lost in the modern age, all because of the consequence of war. All right.